Now let's address spacing in our website. Now, we created an empty file called sample form, and we'll use it later, but for now I just added a couple of elements, a heading tag and a div with a bunch of text in here. We'll first talk about the measurement units. A typical website will generally use one of 4 units of measurement. The first is an absolute unit, and that's generally going to be pixels. It used to be that a computer monitor, a pixel equaled the actual dot size of a dot on a computer monitor. Now computer monitors are much better quality, so each pixel is going to be multiple dots, but that's where the term originally came from. In actual size, it's 1/96th of an inch. A typical website has a default size of 16 pixels per letter. Now let's see this in action. Now I've actually created an inline style sheet so that our styles and HTML is on the same page. A couple things to notice. We set the background color to light gray to make a contrast. For our elements, we put the background color to light blue. Now the default text size for a browser is 16 pixels. Let's change that to 12 and see what it looks like. Command S. We can see they shrunk a little bit. Let's put it back to 16. Command S. There we go. Now we put our heading in an H1 tag, top level heading. That happens to have a default size of double the base size, so 32 pixels. If we comment this out and save it, it's going to be no change. Uncomment it, change it to 42, save it. You can see it grew back to 32. Now let's do something else. Let's remove the H1 tag. So now it's just a normal div and save it. A couple things happened. Well, the font size stayed the same because we set it here manually. But an H1 heading makes the text bold, and it also adds some margin to the top and the bottom. By setting it to a normal div, the margin disappeared. Let's undo these changes and save it. And now our margin is back and it is bold again. Now let's take a look at relative units. When you're dealing with the whole size of your computer screen, it's not uncommon to use percentages. Right here, we set the width of this element to 400 pixels. To put it in perspective, a normal size laptop, you might want to have your screen at 1,000 pixels. For a smartphone, it might be around 500, just something like that. But instead of setting it in absolute units, let's set it as a percent of the viewable screen to 50%. And Command S to save it. And you can see it's 50%. If we change the size of the screen, it still stays at 50%. Whereas if we go back to the 400 pixels we had, save it, and change the size of the screen now, because we set it as an absolute value, it's not going to change. For clarification, if you use percent for the height or width, it's in relation to the parent element's height or width. The next two relative units that are commonly used are M and RM. M originally came from the printing world. I believe it represented the size of a capital letter M, but for CSS, M represents the size of the current element's font, and RM represents the size of the root element's font. For all major browsers, that defaults to 16 pixels. So one RM is going to be 16 pixels, 2 RM 32 pixels, etc. Of the two, RM is generally favored because it avoids the risk of cascading font size changes. Browsers use M as default for the heading element sizes. H1 tags, the font size is 2M by default, double the normal font size, 32 pixels in this case. And we can prove that out by changing the font size from 16 to 20 and save it, Command S. Watch the size change over here. That's because it's in relation to the base font size. Now, why didn't this change? Because we set the font size right here specifically. If I comment that out and Command S again, Now it increases in size 25% because we added 25% to the font size here. And if I get rid of this, it'll go back to the default of 16 pixels. Save it, Command S, and there we go. Now let's take a look at the spacing. HTML has something called a box model. Every element is surrounded by a box. You've got the content that you can see. It's got a width and a height, and around that is some padding, and then a border, and then a margin outside the border. This creates a buffer between the content of the element and the next element to its right or left or top or bottom. Now every element has default values for all these properties. For most of your elements the default is 0, but some of them do have values by default. The H1 header element we saw earlier did have some margin on the top and the bottom. We haven't looked at buttons yet, but buttons have a border around it, visible border. Most elements don't have a border. And one thing we can do is set these values in our CSS. Let's see how to do that. Now let's make one quick change. The width property only affects the content area, same with the height. It's a little easier to reason with if the width also includes the padding and the border, and same with the height. So we can change that in our site. Now to do that, at the root element, which is the HTML element, we set the box sizing property to border box. And if you're wondering what all this stuff is, the asterisk is a wildcard. It means every element. This before and after is a pseudo class. It's just required for this to work. Box sizing inherit means that every element inherits this box sizing property. In other words, you have to do it this way for it to apply across your entire site. Another thing we're going to do is set the body margin to 0. And before we save it, let's go to the website. You'll notice there's a margin around our content. This is 8 pixels. All browsers have that margin by default. It's just easier if we eliminate that. And again, Bootstrap does that as well. So let's save it. And you can see that margin went away. Now let's add some margin, border, and padding to our two elements. Now one thing to notice is the body element here affects everything on our site. For instance, the background color is light gray, so our whole site has a background of light gray. Now if we wanted to impact another element like H1, then we list the tag and list the style rule. Let's set the margin to 0. Now notice by default this H1 element has a margin on the bottom and the top. If we override that, set it to 0, save it with Command S, you can see it went away. Now we've got our H1 tag, and embedded in that is a div with our class of heading. So if we want to impact just the div, let's go to our heading class. Let's add a padding to it. Command S to save it. So now you can see that there's 20 pixels on all sides of it. Let's add a margin of 10 pixels. Command S. In between it, let's add a border. And there are 3 properties. We've got the width, set it to 1 pixel. The style, let's make it solid. And color. Command S to save it. And now we've got a border around it. One thing to notice is any property, like the color that we set for the element, impacts the area on the padding right here, but not the margin. Now let's do something similar with the box model. If we just want to set the margin or padding or border on one side, then you add the side, top, bottom, right, or left. Hit Command S, and you can see now we've got a margin on the bottom. Let's add a margin on the top. Let's make it 10 pixels. Command S. Now notice it didn't do anything. That's because we have a margin on the bottom of our heading div and a margin of the same size on the top of this element. So they just overlap and collapse on each other. and it'll take the largest size of the top or the bottom. So I changed it to 20, and it should increase from 10 to 20. Command S, and it does. Now we haven't done anything with the height, so let's do that. Set it at 300 pixels. Command S to save, and there we go. Now let's head over to our style sheet. The first thing we're going to do is set the box sizing property to border box, and we'll do that at the root element, HTML. And we're going to set the margin of the body element to 0. Let's go to our index.html page. You can see the default 8 pixel margin around all our content. Let's save this with Command S, and you can see it went away. Now let's go over to the index page. First, make sure that we're using our own style sheet, which we are, rather than the Bootstrap one. Now we're going to add a container around our main elements. So we don't want our content to be right up against the edge here. We do want some margin. So within the navigation bar element, navbar, we'll add a div with a class of container. And within the main element, we'll add a class container. And then all the way down here at the footer, we'll insert a div with a class of container. Back up to the top. Now let's save this, Command S. It didn't do anything because we haven't set the styles yet. Let's do that now. Let's uncomment this. Now the first thing you'll notice are all these medias right here. These are breakpoints. It has to do with responsiveness and different screen sizes. So a smartphone is going to be around this width or a little bigger. A laptop would be 992, and a larger monitor would be 1200 or more. So how does this work? So the browser will look at the width of the browser area. If it's at least this wide, 576, then the container class contained in here will be enacted, and it will give a maximum width of 540 pixels of our screen. Now if the screen is at least 768 pixels or wider, then this container class will apply, and a maximum width of 720 pixels will apply. If the screen is at least 992 pixels, then this one applies, and our maximum width will be 960 pixels. This would be like a laptop size. And finally, if the minimum width is 1200 pixels, like a decent sized monitor, then the container class here will apply, and the maximum width of our content will be 1140 pixels. Now it has to be in this order. For a larger screen, all of these are going to apply. Let's say a large monitor, this is going to apply, but then this will supersede it, and then this will supersede it, and then this will supersede that. If it's a smartphone, this will apply, but this may be too big, and it will stop here. You'll have your maximum width here. And we'll see it in action in just a minute. Now for the width, we're going to set it at 100% of whatever this is, of whichever media applies. And we're going to set padding of 0.75 RM on both the right and the left. Now remember, 1 RM represents the font size of the root element, which unless you purposely change it, on a major browser is going to be 16 pixels. So since we're doing 0.75 of that, it's going to be 12 pixels on both the right and the left. Then we've got this margin here. We didn't talk about auto. That just means the browser is going to automatically calculate what the margin is going to be based on how much space is available. So let's go ahead and save this. Keep your eye over here and let's see what happens. Okay. Now we have margin on the left and right. And let's see the responsiveness. This is the smallest width. Right now this is what's applying. Let's make it wider. We just hit a breakpoint. So now it's got a maximum width of 720 pixels. Let's continue. Hit another breakpoint. Now we've got a maximum width of 960 pixels. So this is 960. We just hit our last breakpoint. Now our container won't get any wider than 1140 pixels. Now let's create some utility classes to set the padding, margin, and borders. As usual, we're mimicking the Bootstrap classes. They have utility classes. If it starts with an M, then it adjusts the margin. If it starts with a P, it adjusts the padding. If it's border, then it adjusts the border. If it adjusts only one side, then it'll have a letter after that, T for top, B for bottom, S for start, E for end. Start is margin left, end is margin right. They do it that way so it can apply in languages that read right to left, like Arabic. So following that is a dash and then a size ranging from 1 to 5. Now these sizes all use RM rather than pixels for responsiveness. So if it's a small screen like for a smartphone, it may have a smaller base font than 16, and then the margin and padding will adjust down accordingly. And as you recall, the base font in all major browsers is 16 pixels. So 1 RM is 16 pixels. 0.25 is going to be 4 pixels. 0.5 is going to be 8 pixels. 1 RM is going to be 16 pixels. 1.5 is going to be 24. And 3 is going to be 32. And these correspond with a dash 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. One last thing to note is we have a class for rounded when it comes to a border, and that sets a border radius of 0.25 RM, so 4 pixels. And also notice that we've got the exclamation important following each class declaration. That's to ensure that this size takes precedence. Now let's go see how we're going to use these in the index.html file. I've placed each utility class commented out right above the element. We'll place them one by one and see the result. Okay, here we are adding the MB4 class that'll add margin at the bottom of 4, which translates to 1.5 RM, which is 24 pixels. Let's save it. It's going to add a margin here. Let's save it and see what happens. Okay, so now this should be 24 pixels. Now we've added padding and margin to this highlighted article right here. The P-4 class will add padding on all 4 sides, and the 4 translates to 1.5 RMs or 24 pixels. PMD5, that's for Bootstrap's responsiveness. It's not something we're going to duplicate in our code right here, but when we connect to Bootstrap, what it will do is increase the padding for a larger size screen. MB4 adds a margin at the bottom. The 4 translates to 1.5 RMs or 24 pixels. Rounded will add rounded corners to our box element here. Now let's save it and see what happens. Okay, looks much better. Now let's do something else. This is just for our own code. This call MD8 in Bootstrap means it'll only take up 2/3 of the width of the available element. So we're going to duplicate that in our CSS with this class width-67, which is 67% or 2/3. Let's save it and see what happens. Okay, so now this text will only take up 2/3 of this element. Inside the article element, we place this div just so that we could limit ourselves to 2/3 of the space. Add this here. Okay, this my class, my-3, will add margin on the y-axis, which is the vertical axis. So it'll add margin to both the top and the bottom. The -3 translates to 1 RM or 16 pixels. And that should add margin to this area right here. We save it, Command S. That should be about 16 pixels on the top and the bottom. Now we're going to add space to these articles right here. So what we've done is we've added a margin at the bottom. 3 translates to 1 RM or 16 pixels. And we've also added a border at the bottom. So we should have a horizontal line on the bottom of each one of these articles. Let's save it, Command S. There we go. There's that horizontal line, the border. And now this About section, let's style that. Now we're going to add padding on all four sides. P-4 translates to padding of 1.5 RMs or 24 pixels. We're going to add a border around all four sides, and we're going to round the corners. Let's save it, Command S. There we go. Let's go down to the footer. Now we're going to add margin to the top of 3, which translates to 1 RM or 16 pixels. And then we're going to add padding on the y-axis, the vertical axis, so it's going to be both the top and the bottom, of 4, which translates to 1.5 RM or 24 pixels. And we're going to put a border on the top. Let's scroll up a little so we can see it. There's the footer now. Save it, Command S. Now we've got the border on the top and the padding and the margin. Now a couple things I didn't plan for is we've got some conflict here with the heading. So I'm going to set in the heading elements the margin on top to 0, and we haven't defined those classes. Let's go to the styles. Save it. Okay, it eliminated those conflicts. All right, we're getting there. Now let's see what our site will look like if we use Bootstrap classes instead of our homemade classes. Let me uncomment the Bootstrap link and comment out our own style sheet. Save it with Command S. Actually, I have to refresh it. Okay, looks pretty similar. One thing you'll notice is the sidebar went away because it's responsive. Let's bring it back. Okay. Now let's do the same thing to the article template page. I've actually already done it. Pretty much identical to what we did on the other page. Let's take a look at it. We won't walk through it line by line like we did before. So let me just save it and see what it looks like. Refresh the page. Okay. And now using Bootstrap, I'm using the shortcut key Command/ to toggle the comment on and off. Command/, Command/. Save it, Command S, and let's see what it looks like. Pretty similar. Okay, that concludes this section on spacing.